really don't need it, but
It's got a teacher voice.
yeah, exactly. So, welcome everybody to the Connolly Forum. Tonight's topic: the fight for living wage and a $15 minimum. The campaign to make that happen has been ongoing for a number of years, and hopefully is steadily gaining traction. We've seen little incremental changes here and there. I myself come to the forum as the invited chair because I've sort of stepped up in the last 6 months and become sort of known in the labor circles a little bit in a way I'd never been before. I'm an adjunct professor at St. Rose in Albany, and we recently, as you might have heard, had a nice resounding 3-1 victory to form a new union. We have our first membership meeting on Monday. Just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on adjunct professors in general, because I think that this isn't really a term that people are that familiar with, or a position that people are that familiar with, largely because it's sort of been a new trend in academia where they've really changed the business model. And it's, for starters, it's sad to even use the phrase business model when you're talking about academia. We like to think of it being something, I don't know, higher than that, right? Morally different than just a business, but ultimately, you know, we have students, they bring in dollars, those dollars get allocated by administrations who are essentially our management, and conveniently keep giving themselves really nice raises. And the way that they've managed to do that, well, the two ways that they've managed to do that is first, steadily increasing student tuitions. We've seen 500% inflation in college prices in the last 20 years. It's just obscene. It's so far beyond anything we've seen in any other industry or, you know, profession. So this is a tremendous problem. It saddles students with a humongous amount of debt. The average undergraduate student in the United States graduates with about $25,000 in student debt. You can imagine how long that takes to pay off. Quite a while. When you're somebody like myself who went on to a graduate degree, in my case a PhD, you're talking about 6-figure student debt. A really substantial number. And when I took on that debt, I was told from the get-go, look, this is good debt. Like the whole concept of good debt. And I bought it. I believed them. Because what they said made sense at the time, and it seemed reasonable. Which is, first of all, this is an investment in your future, it'll pay back, right? Okay, fine. But they also said, look, there's a lot of baby boomers who are in these teaching positions. They're about to start graduating en masse. And when they do, there's gonna be jobs for you guys for days. Oh my God, there can be so many jobs. Great jobs. And we said, yeah, all right, that makes sense. There's a hell of a lot of baby boomers. What we didn't understand was that what was gonna happen is that when those baby boomers left, they were going to be replaced by 3 part-time adjunct professors who get paid an absolute pittance and no benefits and have 0 job security, are moved from position to position on a semester-to-semester basis, no contracts to speak of to keep them in positions. So what they have essentially done is casualized the academic workforce. They've converted over almost wholesale. In the time that I was in graduate school from 2000 to 2008, the transition was unbelievably rapid. We essentially went from 75% full-time tenure professors, 25% part-time adjuncts, to 75% adjuncts, 25% full-time tenure-track professors. That was a radical transformation in the way it was done. And it wasn't just at St. Rose. St. Rose in that period from, well, in 95 there were 4% tenure, or 4% part-time adjuncts. Now it's 58%. So the change has been dramatic, and it's happened at schools across the country and in Canada and a lot of other places as well, as part of the overall neoliberal economic dynamic that we've seen in so many industries that have forced so many people into essentially unwanted, undesirable part-time positions. People who thought that there was going to be full-time work for them and then came out and found that those full-time jobs just didn't exist, that the social contract had changed. St. Rose pays us $800 a credit hour. We generally teach 3-hour classes, which means we make $2,400 a class, and they cap us at 2 classes a semester, which means if you're teaching fall and spring and you have a full load, which you're lucky if you do, because most people end up with 1 class, you make $9,600 for the year. with a PhD and the ongoing research and six-figure student loans, right? It's just, you can't live on it, you can't function with it. It forces us to teach at 2 or 3 different schools and try to cobble together a minimum living. What we've seen in the last couple of years is a real move to unionize adjuncts. This hadn't been going on for a long, long time. Certainly post-2008, the economic situation made things even worse. More schools moved to this, more positions were part-time from that point on, and they justified it obviously based on, you know, the economy stuff. We all have to tighten our belts. And so people didn't really fight it, I don't think, for quite a while in the way that they should have. It would have been great if in 2000 they started fighting this battle, but we really didn't get it. And in 2008, we got set back and people felt like, well, now is not the time to really make this happen. But at this point, there's been enough of an economic recovery that that excuse no longer really holds water, especially when you look at skyrocketing administrative salaries, a doubling literally in the last 20 years of administrators nationwide at colleges. Not sure if there's been a doubling of the work that administrators do, but there's twice as many of them there as there ever was. So it's really changed the dynamic to look at the way they continue to do fine and tell everybody else we have to basically balance the budget on your backs. So in the last few years, we've begun to see a lot of schools step up and unionize, and I tend to be fairly antisocial and don't really love too much doing the individual outreach, or I might have started this a couple of years ago. But in fall of last year, I was offered a great class. It's called Creating Social Justice. And every Friday I would bring in a speaker, a guest speaker, and it turned out in the course of one semester I brought in 3 labor organizers. And it got me thinking about my situation. And then spring came along and I had 2 classes and I was slated for 2 classes, and they called me up the week beforehand and said, oh sorry, you only had 9 enroll out of the necessary 10, so we're canceling one of your 2 classes. So now I'm 50% down on the money that's coming in, the already tiny pittance, and I got some time on my hands. Big mistake. Yeah. Right? So by February I was sending out emails. Pretty soon we had mobilized an organizing committee, and in what seems to be record time, we've put together the union cards necessary to qualify for an NLRB vote. We've held the vote and we won overwhelmingly. So I'm very pleased about that. So that's why I'm here. I want to discuss a little bit about the namesake of the event, James Connolly, one of the great socialist leaders of the 20th century by far, also a real, genuine rebel who lived his ideology in a way that a lot of us hopefully do, but many people fail to, I think. He was born in the late 1860s, 68, actually in Scotland, in Edinburgh, Scotland, in a small, essentially clustered neighborhood of Irish immigrants. Spent some years there, eventually made his way to the United States in the early 1900s and settled here in Troy in 1903. So the local connection is very strong. Had a house here at 96 Ingalls Ave, not too far from where the forum's taking place tonight. He worked for Metropolitan Insurance until it faltered and went under. But he was very activist. He was an editor of the socialist newspaper. He was one of the co-founders of the Social Labor Party, or the Socialist Labor Party, the Socialist Party of a member of the Socialist Party of America, a member of the IWW. In his years here, he oftentimes found himself at odds with some of the leadership of these organizations over issues such as fighting for a fair wage, which I guess was a radical notion in his day a little bit. He had returned about 1910 to Ireland, where his people were from, where he was known as Seamus O'Connolly. And when he was there, he was very active in labor struggles, the great Dublin lockout of 1913. He was also one of the ground commanders for the Irish Citizen Army when they rose up against British rule in 1916. At this time, he was badly injured and taken captive by the British Empire, who eventually executed him for his role in that uprising. So a very interesting historical figure, certainly a role model for anybody who really wants to walk the walk. and quite a socialist in his own right. So, that said, by way of introduction, wanted to open the floor if anybody had any comments or announcements they'd like to make before we proceeded into the talk for the evening. Yeah.
I got some, Howie Hawkins is running for governor. I got some flyers there, you can take all you want, and I got 2 road signs if anyone wants them as well.
Really?
There's an event that piggybacked from an event here. It's called the Soul Cafe Albany, and it came off the idea of the Soul Cafe that's here on Monday nights. I think yours is the first Monday of the month, or third?
Second.
Second,
It was
okay.
last night.
Okay. But Albany has one, and it's at the Westminster Presbyterian Church between State Street and Chestnut on the 28th, which is the 4th Monday of each month. And it's all healthy food, and volunteers put it together, and it's a donation of $5 recommended for adults and $3 for kids, and it's to build community. I understand the one here is fabulous.
Excellent, good to know. See, John?
Just the next forum in the series will be on December 2nd. Vijay Prashad will be here. So I hope you all make time for that.
All right, sounds good. Anybody else? All right, if not, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Stephanie Luce, who's an associate professor of labor studies at the Murphy Institute, City University of New York, CUNY, which I hear is a very large school. I actually haven't been down there, so that was interesting to hear that they were as sizable as they are. She earned her PhD in sociology, master's degree in industrial relations from one of my favorite places in the world, University of Madison, Wisconsin. Great town. Spent a lot of years there, a lot of visits there when I was young. I was just outside of Chicago myself, so I used to make the run up there on a regular basis. She's previously worked in a lot of different places: University of Massachusetts Amherst's Labor Center, worked for the U.S. Department of Labor, a Congressional Commission on Agricultural Workers, Center for Wisconsin Strategy, Political Economy Research Institute, variety of reputable, fine projects and locations. She has a number of books, articles galore. I've been reading up for days on things that she's written that I can find online or other spots, so I've been very pleased. Books Fighting for the Living Wage, co-authored 2 books, The Living Wage, Building a Fair Economy, and another, The Measure of Fairness. And most recently has published a new book, Labor Movements, Global Perspectives, by Polity Press in 2014, so just this year. Our current research is focused on low wage and global labor markets, labor standards, trade, labor and community coalitions. So I would like to thank her for being here and welcome her to the podium for comments on the living wage and a $15 minimum wage campaign.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming. It's really an honor to be here. I've heard about this forum. I've had friends speak here and haven't had a chance to visit. And I'm very impressed so far with Troy. It's beautiful up here. So, of course, the weather helps a lot. But so the living wage. So I want to talk just about some of the context. Of course, the term living wage is not a new term. It's been around for hundreds of years. And in fact, when it was first used in the 1800s, well, maybe even before that, but at least in the 1800s, in some ways it was seen as a concession to the whole idea of wage labor. People were fighting the emergence of capitalism and paid labor, and people were saying we should not give in to wage labor. But if we're going to lose that fight, we should at least demand that we be paid a living wage for the work that we do. But even from the start, it was not the ideal demand. I think many people would have preferred not to have the whole system of wage labor to begin with. So, but the term's been used in many different ways, often to represent a specific hourly figure meant to cover people's basic cost of living. sometimes to represent more this notion of dignity and the dignity of our work. And in fact, when Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, the workers there were fighting for a living wage, sanitation workers on strike for a living wage, representing both an hourly demand but also a moral claim, a claim to say, I'm a man, I have worth in this society. But we get to the more modern era of the living wage movement in the United States, emerges again in 1994 in Baltimore. And what we found is, that the federal minimum wage had not been raised in many years. For those of you who don't know, the law does not specify a wage or a formula or anything. It's completely arbitrary. It's raised just by an act of Congress. Other countries have, some have wage boards to determine what should the wage be, should it go up with inflation and so forth. Here it's completely political. And as unions lost power, workers lost power, Congress was not increasing the minimum wage. And by the early 1990s, we were seeing the rise of working poverty. 25%, 30% of US workers earning an hourly wage that would not even reach the federal poverty line. So in 1994, some pastors in Baltimore, Maryland, realized a lot of the people coming into the food pantries and the shelters were people who were working, sometimes working full-time, and didn't have enough money by the end of the month to cover their rent or their food. And they built a coalition with AFSCME, the public sector union, pastors in the area, community organization, and went to the city and demanded, we demand a higher wage for workers that are working for the city of Baltimore or in the city. The city said, we don't have the authority to raise the wage for the city, but they pushed and they campaigned, and eventually they came up with this notion of a living wage ordinance that would say the city would require any business doing business with the city, such as through a service contract, to pay a wage high enough to meet the federal poverty line for a family of 4. Wasn't great, it was the poverty line, but it was still almost twice the minimum wage. So it was seen as a victory, and quickly a lot of other cities began launching these campaigns. It wasn't ideal. People wanted to raise the federal minimum wage or the state minimum wage, but we had no power to do that. And we felt like at the local level we have more leverage. It's one place where we have a chance against the big money that we have no chance at the federal level. So the living wage campaigns were not, they were not necessarily going to solve poverty, but they were a way to build coalitions. And in fact, some places they were bringing together coalitions of people that hadn't really ever worked together before. Sometimes, building trades and environmentalists, students and public sector unions, a lot of clergy groups, building coalitions around the country promoting this idea of a living wage. Now, some people at the time were like, we should not call this a living wage. It's winning a poverty level. It's winning the poverty line. Like, let's not call it a living wage. And there was some debate about that, saying, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I think the view kind of won out is like, well, it's still an increase. We want to fight for it, and the term has power. And we could always try and win a wage and then continue to push higher. And I think that, there was, some back and forth about whether or not this was a good idea. The other concern was these are not covering a lot of workers. They're just covering workers who do business with the city in some form. But again, the thought was, well, we don't have a lot of power. Let's win what we can, and let's see what we can do from there. So the movement kind of takes off, and by the late 2000s, well, first I should say too, one of the reasons why they were doing well is that this notion of a living wage or a higher minimum wage has been popular ever since we have polling data, going back to the 1940s and 50s. Every poll shows a majority of Americans support the notion of a higher minimum wage. And we know even right now, even Republicans, majority of Republicans support this notion. So it's not a controversial notion in terms of voters. It is a controversial notion in terms of economists and policymakers. But I'll address that in a minute. So this movement takes off. We see more and more living wage campaigns getting active. By the early 2000s, over 120 cities and counties around the country have living wage ordinances. Students are starting them on university campuses. We're seeing some in places like airports and ports and sports arenas. People are just looking for a hook, any way to say, can we get some power here to raise wages? Because we're not winning them at the federal level. Our unions are too weak. We're not able to unionize low-wage workers. This is one way to do it. And it was enormously successful. I mean, it won in most places. In fact, interestingly enough, some of the cities where they were not winning included like some of the small kind of so-called liberal cities like Ann Arbor, and those were places where people were so confident, they're like, oh, I'm on the city council, I'll just try and pass this, and then they couldn't get it passed. But where there was an actual campaign and they were building coalitions, they were winning these campaigns. And I should say too that even though there were some critiques, like that these wages are not high enough, a lot of people thought, well, this isn't our only thing, let's build these coalitions and keep going and we'll see what we can do. Okay, so just some more chronology on this is by the early 2000s, well, first we hit this recession in 2001, and I had been working on living wages since I got involved in 1995 in Milwaukee, and then I started doing research, and I kept thinking every year, okay, we've peaked, this is the end of this, and then more kept going and more kept going, and then the recession hit in 2001, and the movement started to slow down a bit, and then it just picked up again, and we actually started getting momentum to start passing wages at the state level, to start putting issues on the ballot at the state level, and also some cities began experimenting with, can we actually pass a citywide minimum wage? So I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with this notion of home rule, but states have laws that kind of establish what cities have the authority to do. And this is an issue in New York. New York cities do not have the authority to establish their own wages, but many states in the West Coast do. So we saw city of San Francisco, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, New Mexico. A couple cities began passing citywide minimum wages that would apply to employers, all employers within the city. And that became then the battleground of trying to contest, saying, okay, a local living wage ordinance is fine, but it's not covering a lot of workers. Can we expand coverage to the whole city? And there's lots of details on that. I mean, one side note is New Orleans in 96 or 98, I'm now forgetting, voters passed a ballot overwhelmingly to establish a citywide minimum wage in the city of New Orleans. The state then stepped in, and driven by the restaurant and hotel lobbies, got a law passed to overrule their right to do so. And that went to the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, yes, we're gonna take away your city's right to pass that minimum wage. So it's just it was kind of a tragic story, because then when Katrina happened several years later, kind of felt like, if maybe more people had higher wages, more people would have had access to getting out of the city and had some resources. But, so that was one of the battlegrounds, is can we pass these citywide? And then we moved to the states and said, can we start getting states to raise their minimum wage? And through this momentum, we were able to get some increases at the federal level, first in 96, and then actually, weirdly enough, under the Bush administration, getting another increase to the federal minimum wage. But still, it's not high enough. And in part because it doesn't go up automatically with inflation, so you pass an increase and within a year it's already out of date. Moving into the chronology of, we go through this wave, we get lots of cities to pass ordinances, states are passing higher state, we get some increase in the federal, but by 2008, 2009, we again hit another recession, this time depression, pretty major, and this seems like this movement is really kind of grinding to a halt. And I remember even thinking, and I moved to New York City in 2010. At that time, the city activists were trying to expand the New York City living wage ordinance to cover firms that received economic development money. So if Walmart comes to town and they get $1 million in tax breaks, they should have to pay a living wage. Or even more importantly, if a developer builds a whole mall, all of those tenants, those retailers, should have to pay a living wage. And while I thought it was a good idea, I was aware at the time that the wage that they were demanding was $10 an hour. This was in 2010 in New York City, in Manhattan, $10 an hour. And it just seemed like, what have we come to? We've been fighting this campaign for 15 years, and we're still like cannot even get $10 an hour in New York City to make Walmart, like Walmart gets $1 million. So it felt at that moment, I was feeling pretty discouraged, like, I don't know what we've won. Like, has it been worth it, all these years of fighting? So instead, that was stalled. The Democratic City Council would not even bring it to a hearing in New York City. And activists kind of turned to some other areas, like We can't win higher wages. Let's try and pass paid sick day leave. Let's try and pass community benefits agreements, which apply to new developments in particular regions. But I think there was a lot of concern, like there's, working poverty is as bad as ever, and we don't have the power to change it. So what happens? In my view of this story, the next year Occupy Wall Street happens, and suddenly inequality is back on the map. Not that we were all talking about it for a long time, but now other people are talking about it too. Suddenly the Pope's talking about inequality. I guess he had a lot more power than Occupy. I don't know, but suddenly people are like, okay, this is an issue. And soon we see in New York City fast food workers go on strike. And this is primarily organized through SEIU and Fight for a Fair Economy Coalition. And I would say at that moment, some of you folks are here maybe from SEIU or have experience with this. I think that people would agree that they did not really have a full strategy. And I think there was a sense that, we don't know what's working. We're trying everything to organize low-wage workers. It's really challenging. Let's just try this and see what happens. Let's demand a higher wage and let's go bold. Let's stop talking $10 an hour. Let's go 15. That's that's still low, but it's a big jump. Like it really takes us forward, and it's bold, and it's also, and let's demand the right to a union, because we know that without a union, the higher wage might not even be enforced. So the fast food strikes happened first in New York City, but quickly spread Chicago, Seattle, around the country. And within the next couple of years, we have more and more fast food strikes. We have the development of not just fast food, but the Fight for 15, talking about higher wages in retail. We have the election of a socialist city councilor in Seattle, who then also is pushing $15 an hour as a citywide minimum wage. And I have a hard time explaining this because, just from the perspective of working on this issue and the organizers I've worked with for 15 years, things really changed rapidly. I really thought this movement had seen its last days, and within maybe a year, it felt like things were suddenly different, and the movement's now exploding. And in fact, I would say it's the first time actually it's 20 years now, that I actually cannot keep up with all of the action that's going on. What's going on right now, we see more and more cities pushing the notion of a citywide minimum. It's not just Seattle, it's also a CTAC, $15 an hour. San Francisco voters are going to be voting on $15 an hour in November. Many West Coast cities are establishing citywide minimum wages. You may know New York City is also pushing for 15 years, we were told it's not possible, it is impossible to set a citywide minimum. Partly through some questionable negotiations with the governor, it's plausible that if all goes well in the elections, that New York State will then authorize cities to establish their own citywide minimum, and New York may be setting a minimum of $13 an hour. Chicago, other cities. And we also have states returning again to trying to raise minimum wages at the state level. In fact, this November, all of the states with ballot initiatives are red states, and again, we know Republicans support higher minimum wages. Federal level, still stalled out, and that's just to say that, throughout this movement from the very beginning, neither the Democrats or Republicans were supporters of raising the minimum wage. And an interesting story, in fact, in 2004, Florida had a initiative on the ballot to raise the minimum wage, and somebody I know, a wealthy gentleman that I know, was trying very hard to persuade Ralph Nader to drop out of the presidential race. And Nader said, if you can get John Kerry to support raising the minimum wage, maybe I'd consider it. Now, I don't know if he really was going to, but he said that. So this wealthy individual called up John Kerry campaign and said, will you endorse the Florida minimum wage? I'll pay for all of the TV commercials. I'll do the whole thing. And the Kerry campaign said, no, we don't want to be associated with the raising the minimum wage, right? Because it's not part of their platform. It was seen as not friendly to business. He did not endorse the Florida minimum wage. Voters went on to approve that in every single county in Florida. And many people have looked at the numbers and said, look, if Kerry had endorsed it and affiliated, it's possible he would have actually won Florida, possibly could have been president, because the issue is popular. It was even winning among evangelical Christians. It was winning among every demographic except for, I think, people earning over $250,000 a year. So, shock. Okay, so, I should say, so we have this growing momentum. These campaigns are going on all over the country right now, and I should also say internationally. Over the last several years, particularly since the global recession, the International Labor Organization and several countries have also given increased attention to the issue of low-wage work. In fact, Germany passed a minimum wage, established a minimum wage for its first time in modern history last year, because I should say that's a good thing and a bad thing. Like, it sounds good, yeah, minimum wage is a good thing. It represents the fact that the unions are so weak that wages had been established at a higher level through collective bargaining. They have a massive growing low-wage labor market, so they're setting a minimum wage. So it's not like this is all good news, it reflects a problem, but increasingly many countries are paying attention. One of the countries that happens to be raising its minimum wage the most quickly at the province level is China. We see, in fact, I was there doing a living wage study a couple years ago because they're trying to figure out how do we stop these massive strike waves. Can we raise wages and actually quell the strikes? And again, mixed message, because maybe we want the strikes to continue, we don't want it necessarily to stop just from a higher wage, but it reflects this issue that is a global issue, which is we have a massive issue of working poverty and low-wage work. Okay, so that is a little bit just kind of the overview of the chronology of the movement. So I want to talk about some of the issues related to how to think about this. One of the first things to talk about is the wage level itself. And I think that some people get really hung up on the actual technical wage. And certainly the ILO does. The ILO spends many hours trying to define how many, like what proportion of calories, what proportion of meats versus fats versus vegetables do we need to survive. You know, maybe there's some place for that kind of work, but to me, it's really about a political demand. There's gonna never be one right wage. Even, you know, working side by side, you know, maybe you have children and maybe I've taken care of elderly parents. We have different wage needs. So I think that really what we wanna aim for is an amount that's gonna cover some basic needs, but then the power of workers to demand the wage that they know that they need, right? We need workers' voices in here to say, what's the wage that we need? We don't need technical experts to determine that for them. That's my opinion, even though I'm one of those technical experts. But so 15 is, you know, is much better than 10. But the fact is, it's still not quite necessarily a self-sufficiency wage. And in fact, the New York Times editorial board even made a comment that the 1313 that the New York City Council is considering is too low. But anyways, anything that moves it up is useful at this time because we're so far below what workers need. But that raises a couple issues. One is, what's the impact, right? So when we first started this work, there was a pretty strong, overwhelming consensus among economists and among policymakers that minimum wages at all was a bad thing, and raising minimum wages was a really bad thing. We heard that it will cause unemployment, it will cause inflation, it will cause entire industries to move overseas, it will cause minority-owned businesses to lose contracts, it will cause taxes to go up. And in fact, in Florida, when they were considering this ballot measure for the minimum wage, I don't know if any of you remember 2004, Florida had been hit by like, I think 3 or 4 hurricanes in a row, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this happened to be called Prop 5, and all the commercials were comparing the minimum wage to a 5th hurricane. And the commercials were showing like people dying in the streets and old people like have no food and everything, you know, all of this because we were gonna maybe raise the minimum wage, I think by $1 an hour. So, so I would say across the board, every mayor, no matter what party, and every newspaper editorial board almost across the board said this is a terrible thing. It will cost jobs and it will wreak havoc on the economy. So 10 years later, 10 years after that, we were able to do lots of economic impact studies, both on living wage and minimum wage, and study after study found no negative impact. this was crying wolf. All of the stuff that you predicted to come true did not come true. And in fact, many of the business owners that had stepped forward to say, I will move out of the city, I will leave, you go back and they're still there, they're still doing business, they're still getting contracts from the city. So we're not finding any negative impacts of the increasing wages, and we are finding positive impacts on the lives of workers. Now I will say it's not a solution. It's not that raising the minimum wage $1 or $2 an hour is bringing people out of poverty. And that's in particular because many low-wage workers do not have access to full-time hours. Even if they had wages of $20 an hour, but you only have 10 hours a week, you're still going to be in poverty. So it's not the solution, but we found in research that it did allow many workers to quit their second job or to start saving or pay off some bills. And what the research shows is that for the most part, the benefits of the minimum wage increase are very concentrated on the workers, like it makes a big difference in their paycheck, but any cost associated with it is dispersed amongst lots and lots of consumers. So even if we do a pass on entirely, we take an entire pass through, like if McDonald's has to raise its minimum wage and it gives the entire cost onto the price of hamburger, the hamburger would go up by 1 cent. Or we found at the Oakland airport, raising the wage to living wages at the Oakland airport, the average ticket price of a flight was going to go up by like 40 cents, something. I don't remember that number exactly. We even looked at what would happen if Walmart raised its wages to $12.50 an hour. The total cost for the average consumer would be something like $12 a year for the year, right? So, and again, this is assuming an entire 100% pass through to the consumer. In fact, we know they could absorb the cost in other ways. They can absorb the cost by reducing managerial salaries, by reducing CEO bonuses. They could also absorb some of the savings through reduced turnover, through lower absenteeism. So there's many other ways in which these costs are being covered, and that's why we don't see these negative effects. We don't see massive unemployment. We definitely don't see inflation. And what's interesting to see is that over time, by now, we've seen a shift in the economics discipline. And now, instead of a consensus within economics that minimum wages are bad, we see increasingly that economists are saying, yeah, some minimum wage increase could be good. It actually can generate economic activity. It can create jobs, not cut jobs. Yet, that doesn't mean the politicians are following suit. We still see, the rhetoric. Bloomberg called this, I remember Bloomberg said, we've tried this before, it was called the Soviet Union, it was a total disaster. So we still hear that kind of rhetoric about raising minimum wages. Okay, let me just say, so we've got issues around the wage level, around the economic impact. And then the other thing that I found is, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, these are not necessarily enforced. Workers who don't have the power to demand higher wages also don't necessarily have the power to demand that they're enforced. So there's a disconnect. And that's why we know that raising wages alone without a union, without worker power, is only going part of the way. It takes one kind of power to win a higher wage, it takes another kind of power to enforce that wage. And so while, again, raising it is good, it's only part of the battle. Okay, so I'm just gonna wrap up by kind of evaluating how to think about this movement, at least the last 20 years in the United States. On paper, there's been tremendous victory. I would say it's one of the most successful movements we've seen in the last 20 years in terms of the numbers of things that we've won, the success rate, the number of workers covered. But I would say, for sure, it's not a solution. The minimum wage, it's a good organizing tool, but as a policy alone, it's very minimal, right? Let's call it the minimum wage. But even the living wage, right? We have lots of people who are unemployed. We have, people that are not helped by this at all. We have lots of people who don't have enough hours of work. We don't have, that don't have enough job security. If you get a higher wage, but then you get fired for union organizing, doesn't help. So certainly minimum wages without unions is not the solution. The other thing I want to say is that the notion of a living wage is very popular, which is a good thing, but it also means that we have some cases, what I would say are least common denominator politics. We agree wages should be higher. Beyond that, when you dig deeper, there's a real rift between people who believe in living wages because they believe these are the deserving poor versus the non-deserving poor. And I always think back to the day that San Francisco voters voted overwhelmingly to establish a citywide minimum wage. On that same day, they also voted overwhelmingly very harsh anti-panhandling ordinances. So on the one hand, okay, we'll reward you because you're a good worker. we're going to punish you because you're asking for money because you don't have enough to live and you're not deserving. So this notion that certain workers are worth it returns us back to this whole notion of wage labor. And I think underneath that, that's the fundamental crux of our problem, is as long as we maintain a system of wage labor, we're going to have this tension, because unemployment is built into capitalism. We're going to have unemployed workers, and just addressing through a higher wage is certainly not enough. So evaluating this movement, I would say it's not enough to evaluate the legislative victories. We have to evaluate it as building a movement. To what extent have these helped build unions? Have workers been able to organize themselves in the workplace? How we've been able to build new political coalitions, new alliances? How we've been able to build political power, building into maybe towards our own independent political movements? And have we been able to do education about how wages are determined, who gets to set wages and why? Why do we have wage labor in the first place? On that, I would say the picture is mixed. I think we've had a lot of success. We have a good dialogue, we have conversation and opening, but there's a lot more way to go. So, but I think framing it in that way, thinking of it not just as the wage itself, I say put the emphasis on the living part and not on the wage. Thinking about what kind of society we want to live in, what kind of people we want to be, how do we want to take care of each other and build our communities. That's the kind of direction we want to move in, and not in this technical direction about what wage level and so forth. But this movement does allow us a space to have those conversations, and I think that's one of the best places to start. So thank you very much.
All right, so at this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions for our speaker, or myself, I guess, if you have any for me as well. Start with Joe there in the back. How's it going, Joe?
Hi.
Good.
Just the discussion about the $15 an hour and the union aspect, I think is very important for all the reasons you said. But I think there's another reason, and that is that $15 is achieved totally outside of the unions. It says to lower workers that unions don't matter to them. And in the whole propaganda that we've heard against unions and the tremendous weakening of the unions in this country, that will lead to a further weakening of the unions, and that will lead to lower wages and more austerity for everybody in the country. So I think it's extremely important for all the reasons you said, as well as this other idea. And I don't think that's out of their mind. I think that they understand that to some extent, the powers that be and corporations. And if they have to raise the wage but not have a union, they will do that. So I think it's very important that we really fight for lower wage workers to be unionized at the same time when we do 15 and just curious what your thoughts. You agree with that?
No, go ahead.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. And I think what we don't have enough data to really completely summarize the last 15 years, but anecdotally, just looking at the cases we know. Like, for example, looking at San Francisco Airport, when we had the living wage campaign there, some of the unions got involved and pushed the living wage campaign and actually were able to convert that to organizing workers. Some of the unions opposed it. We've had unions oppose living wage campaigns saying, we don't want wages set through legislation, that'll be disincentive to organize. And those unions, I think, actually were hurt by it. So by disassociating with it, they were actually hurting themselves. I understand their logic saying that wages should be set through collective bargaining, but given that we haven't been able to win that, I think unions need to be supporting these campaigns and to be seen out front saying, we're gonna fight for higher wages, whether you're a member or not. I think it's really important. And luckily, I think the kinds of rhetoric I heard from unions in the 90s and early 2000s has dwindled. I have not heard any unions saying that kind of thing. Well, there's a few, but fewer, like saying that kind of thing, like we're against living wage. Actually, even I remember in New York City, AFSCME was against living wage because they said more wages that go to non-union workers takes away potential money that could go to our contracts. That they're not saying that anymore. I think that more and more of the unions are realizing we need to be associated with these movements for that reason, so workers see. And I think you're right, absolutely, that I think one of the, again, the good and bad side is we're gonna probably win on wages a lot easier because employers do not want to win on the union. They're gonna fight the unions really hard. So if they can, like the Gap announced they're gonna raise their minimum wage to $9 or $10 an hour, they'd much rather have that than a union. So I think you're right, we have to be careful not to just say, okay, we got our wage, let's go, because then those workers will be fired next week. I don't know why I'm laughing, it's not funny, but you're right, yeah.
Is there also sort of a split with different kinds of unions? For example, now that we have a service economy,
Yeah.
where the majority of unionized labor is pretty much in the service sector unions tend to realize it, they get it.
Right.
But if you look at the craft unions, they're not going to be as supportive, and they don't understand the idea of, I always get this wrong, but raising the water level to bring all the boats
Rising
up.
tide, the
Thank you.
problem.
I'm
Yeah.
bilingual, but yeah.
Yeah. So the unions that were most on board from the start, HRE, the Hotel Restaurant Employees Union, was one of the major drivers of the early living wage campaigns. SEIU was pretty involved as well. Some other unions were mixed. AFSCME was very involved in some places, not in others, so it was not a national position. And even some of the building trades, big opponents in some places, because they're like, hey, our prevailing wage is $45 an hour. I'm not fighting for $9 an hour. But in other places, they were in big alliance because they're like, we have a lot of low-wage workers. So some unions we saw mixed. And then actually, interestingly enough, it wasn't always predictable, but like places like Arizona, steelworkers were leading the campaigns, or Central Labor Councils were leading campaigns. So, but I would say consistently HRE and SEIU were more likely to be in front on this. But, wanting to tie it into organizing and thinking if there's not an organizing tie-in here, then maybe we won't be pushing it.
This is sort of a wacko question. I only see little bits and pieces of what's going on, like when people are actually having an action, like, whatever, Democracy Now! Or something puts it up. How's it working with, like, the public and is this like a really good education tool for, like, I'm just interested to hear how the people that are actually working in these jobs are relating to, or telling about their lives to the people that are going by on the street or whatever, or would have been coming to buy their McDonald's burger or whatever?
Yeah. I actually feel like it's hard to assess too, because I feel like nationally it is playing out differently in different cities. And some, I think Chicago has had a much more extensive network and people are actually doing more organizing, talking to people, building campaigns. Than in some other cities it's more of a strike and not necessarily involving the public. So I think it varies, but I think that it has, in fact, I've heard actually union organizers from other unions, entirely different unions, say it's having a big impact in some of the places we're organizing, because people will see these strikes and they'll come into the workplace and say, why aren't we doing this too, in entirely different industries. Somebody I know organizing warehouse workers in the Midwest said that. So, I think it's, and certainly if you look in the media, you'll hear lots of mixed voices, and some people will say $15 an hour, those workers are not worth it, right? We hear that a lot too. On the one hand, the polls keep showing very high support, so clearly the public is in favor of this. And another funny thing too is, and I remember one of the polls, this was actually not the current campaign, but for minimum wage, they asked voters, do you support a minimum wage increase to $8 an hour? And something like 60% of people did. And then you said, do you support it to $10 an hour? And more people supported a higher wage than a lower, because they're like, if you're going to raise it, raise it. So I think that the $15 isn't necessarily scaring people away. But we do hear people say, like, people aren't worth it, and I'll hear this comment a lot. I went to college for 4 years. I have an advanced degree, and I'm not making $15 an hour. Why should these people who are unskilled make $15 an hour? No, I'm not. But you will hear that kind of conversation, and anyone who's taken an economics class in college is also going to say, well, we know that it's a bad thing. So I think we have a lot of space we still need to claim for that education work, to have those conversations about what is skill, what is value, who determines wages, you know, like kind of the basics of like labor theory of value, you know, notion. So that's why I think this campaign, I think it's valuable because it opens the door for those conversations. They're happening in some places and not others. During living wage movement, we saw really creative things. We had a number of cities engaged in living wage Sundays, where they had integrated in all kinds of different faiths. They would get pastors or rabbis to do a sermon on living wages, and you know, the kind of incorporate it into the services. In some cities they did living wage walks, where they'd pair up people from a church group with the labor council, and they would walk through the neighborhoods knocking on doors to talk about wages. So the more that we can do that kind of thing, the better. I think that is one of the main benefits of these campaigns.
Let's go left or right.
I think,
Or right.
I'd like to get your thoughts on
That
it.
side to that side.
I think some of the unions that have been involved in the living wage campaigns are missing an opportunity to tie it in internationally. And what I mean by that is, we have this huge sector of workers that are making products largely for the American market, in the garment sector particularly, who have the exact same fight, the exact same issues are on the line. Living wages and the right to organize, particularly in places like Bangladesh and Cambodia. And I think that the tying of those issues as an international cause back and forth would be a tremendous way to lift these campaigns up.
Yeah.
It would draw broader support from groups on the fringe that are maybe immigrants here from those countries.
Yeah.
And in a lot of other ways that I think we all could think of.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that.
So I agree 100%. There was been an effort called the Asia Floor Wage. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but coming out of the World Social Forum in Mumbai, a number of garment unions and NGOs got together, and they were like, we're being pitted against each other. If you raise wages in Bangladesh, they'll go to Cambodia. If you raise them in Cambodia, they'll go to Vietnam. So let's try and coordinate our wage campaigns. And they spent a couple of years trying to figure out a formula, because even within the difference between Bangladesh and, you know, Thailand wages are as big as, you know, China to US. So like they spent a couple of years surveying workers, talking like what can be not the same wage, but a common methodology, and kind of building an alliance. And then the notion was, let's drive this from the global south, from Asia, and then get US and European partners on board, either through consumer groups or through retail workers. So that campaign is still around, and there's a Jobs with Justice actually funded an organizer in India for a while to do that. So I think there are people who support that concept. Manifesting it reality on the ground has been much harder. So I think in some of the Walmart work and some of the work around guest workers, either in Walmart or some other industries, has been more successful. And in fact, interestingly enough, the American Federation of Teachers, this is a different industry altogether, but has been supporting unions in the Philippines, teachers unions in the Philippines, like trying to figure out can we have membership, can people join the union in one place and be members in the other, because we have so many guest worker teachers coming in. 15% of school teachers in the Baltimore public schools are from the Philippines now, guest workers. So can we in fact use it as a way to think about wages of teachers in the Philippines and saving jobs for teachers there, along with, you know, raising wages and saving jobs here. So I 100% agree with your notion. Putting it into place has been more challenging, so hopefully we're moving that direction.
Go, Sean.
Yeah, my question is sort of, you know, a lot of the talk around like living wage and minimum wage increases, you know, focuses a lot on, obviously, naturally, you know, the big box stores, the big retailers, the big franchisers. But I wonder, I mean, what your thoughts are. A lot of the other talk about like small businesses, you know, mom and pop coffee shops, especially as they become more established, you know, also rely on a large pool of you know, low wage workers as well. And a lot of the talk, you know, in sort of in terms of legislative approach to this situation is to sort of allow for carve-outs that protect these establishments, which I find really problematic, considering like after a while, especially like for here in Troy, like Daily Grind, as these places become more established, are not struggling by interesting imagination. So I wonder, like, what has been how has this issue been dealt with across the country, and do you agree with these carve-outs? What does the data say about that?
So one of the interesting things that we found is that small employers actually, while they'll say, some may say, I can't survive at minimum wage, if you go back to them afterwards, they actually are fine. And in some ways, one of the reasons why is they often are paying higher average wages. And some of the small employers actually see the large big boxes as a threat exactly for that reason. They'll say, I have long-term employees, I give them raises, they've been here for a while, it makes it really hard for me to compete to the Walmart that's paying across the board minimum wage. So we actually find many small employers who favor the higher wage because they feel it's leveling the playing field more in their direction. And that's been the case certainly in terms of small businesses that bid on city contracts. I remember when Hartford, Connecticut, they used to have a security guard contract that they would get one company would bid on every year, and when they set a living wage requirement, they had 11 companies bid. And in fact, even the Pinkerton security guard threw their hat into the ring, and they said, we can't compete if it's a minimum wage thing. I mean, that's not an example of a small company, but there are many companies that do already pay a higher wage, and so competing at the lower wage, they can't compete. So anyway, so some of the research, including an economics professor who was here at Bard for a while, found that small businesses were not disproportionately hit by the higher minimum wage. The carve-outs are, I think in some of the cities, the citywide minimums like San Francisco, Santa Fe had phase-ins, or like Santa Fe carved out for small employers, but then after 3 years took that away, and San Francisco phased in for smaller employers. I think that might be a reasonable solution, is like over 2 years, like if you're less than 10 employees or less than 15, we'll give you 2 years to phase it in. I don't think it's necessary, I don't know that it's necessary, except when it's a much larger jump, like going from 10 to 15, just even for planning purposes, you can imagine. But I think, that these small employers, the research shows that for the most part they can afford it. And I also think if your business is surviving on the backs of workers' poverty, then we probably don't need that business. That's probably not a business we need to have in our community. So I don't know, that's on tape, I don't know. That's not going to be very popular.
I agree completely with that. Martin.
Yeah, two couple questions. Do you know when they say the CEO makes so many times the lowest paid worker, do they ever include the foreign workers in that, or is that always just American workers? I don't know when they give you that statistic, because I think if it includes the workers in Bangladesh or something, it might go off the charts or something like that. So it's usually just the American workers they include. Yeah.
Further off the chart.
Yeah, further. Yeah, it's still off the chart. And anyway, I've been in arguments for thousands of years, people weren't paid anything at all. You could hire everybody. And you say, we can't hire people, we pay them a decent wage. The White House, the Capitol building, all made with slave labor. Beautiful work. Really cheap. Anyway.
Right.
But anyway, the other thing I wanted to bring up was, I know I came in, but did you talk about the tipped minimum wage? Because I just learned today. Now apparently California. I know New York is at $5.15 an hour is one of the more generous. But California, it is the federal minimum wage or something like that. But I think many states, how many states it's like 2 pennies an hour or something like that for the tip minimum wage. And people even know that. I tell people when you go to the restaurants that you have to tip them because you're pretty much paying their wages. Because without your tips, it's really barely worth going because it's not like the gas money to get there half the time.
Right.
And I don't think people even know that.
Right. So the tipped is $2.35. Is that right? $2.35. And then certain states set it higher. New York is $5. Yeah.
$5 something.
And I think 9 states have tipped workers get the same as the minimum wage, like $9 an hour. So I think there's a push in New York to do that as well, as to eliminate that.
How many states actually give the federal?
I actually don't remember the number. Does anyone know how many? I mean, like there's at least, I think 15, probably at least 15, because the southern states don't have, the many that don't have state minimum wages. So they would have the federal.
Yeah, yeah, they
Yeah.
don't, oh, there's states don't have minimum wage at all.
Yeah, some states do not have their own separate,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, okay.
So yeah, so in I don't know I can't remember the number, but I could probably look it up, but in many states it's still, yeah, 235 is the minimum. Here in New York, 5, and New York I think is proposing to separate out the category, like by, I think restaurant and hospitality workers are gonna stay at 5, and they're gonna maybe raise other kinds of tip
And there's
workers.
something that they're supposed to make up to the minimum wage?
Yeah, a tip credit,
But
so.
there's no way to, like, once again, that's.
It's very hard to enforce, yeah.
How you're gonna enforce that, you
Yeah.
know, I mean, the stewards is just being sued now for
Oh, okay.
not paying employees, you know,
Yeah.
the big money they pay, and
Yeah.
then they're not paying overtime, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I was just, so, with this, but anyway, yeah, I'm trying to think, but anyway, I was thinking of something else, yeah, so basically, I think it was about 15 states or at the federal.
I could probably look it up for you and
Yeah.
give you the exact
No,
number,
that's okay,
but yeah,
we'll
yeah.
look this up.
Yeah.
And they said basically they cut deals. They said, well, let you raise the regular minimum wage if, like, between Red Lobster and Applebee's and, you know, and all those lovely chains, they say
Yeah.
just keep the tip minimum wage the same because we're just doing so poorly here, you know.
Right, yeah, a lot of deal making even on the state
Yeah.
minimum wage, so, you know, there's a lot of evidence, research that shows that tipping is just inherently a discriminatory act, that it's very solidly clear that certain categories, white workers get tipped more than people of color, you know, certain younger workers get tipped more than older workers, you know, and some people have made the case that we should just be fighting it on grounds of
I
equal,
think in Albany, they only hire thin blondes,
Uh-huh.
and I don't know where they get them from because most city, a lot of minority city, but
Yeah.
seriously, I
They're-
get served by.
they're
I
guest
didn't-
workers.
They didn't hire. No, they didn't. I didn't see guest workers. Yeah, they're from the suburbs. That's true. They are. I'm serious. They are. Yeah.
So, so I mean, tipping, you know, I think ideally we would be moving towards abolishing tipping as a system, but the next
Well,
best thing would
countries
be
don't have it.
that we would raise the tips to the minimum. Yeah, enforcement is a huge issue across the board for minimum wage in general. Low-wage workers, just enforcing the regular minimum wage is a problem, so certainly enforcing the tip credit is a big problem.
All right, do we have any ladies that have any questions? We've got quite a few guys in a row here. Yeah, let's go with
I'll
that.
jump on that. I wonder if you could, I'm curious how things are done in countries that capitalist countries that we consider somewhat more enlightened, like, you know, maybe in the Slavic countries or France. How does France do it? And is there how do they set the
Yeah.
minimum wage? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
An example of
Uh-huh.
a different way of doing it.
Yeah.
And the other question I'm having is, as I listen, is where do agricultural workers fit into all this?
Yeah.
In this, are they carved out of this
Right.
discussion?
So, yeah, so the Fair Labor Standards Act does not cover all workers, agricultural workers and domestic workers were excluded. California covers them separately. So I think there's some variation state to state. I think New York's been trying to get coverage for a while, but it's not, I'm not sure at this moment. So other countries, this is a hugely complicated answer because I was actually stunned to realize the variation in the ways that countries set minimum wages. Because first of all, some are set by the month, some are set by the week, some are set by the day, some are, you know, we do the hour. Some have very elaborate methodologies. Australia has an independent wage board that has every year just does a calculation about what's the cost of living, and what's inflation.
How are they selected? I mean, is it appointed?
Yeah, it's an appointed board that's like, you know, I can't remember who exactly, if it's through Congress or whoever appoints. Interestingly enough, the City of London has also a commission that sets what is a living wage for the City of London, and they calculate what's food costs, housing costs, and they include beer as a mandatory item of cost of living, which shocked me to try and imagine doing that in the United States. Can you imagine? We're barely are allowed to have food here, so.
You get in trouble for buying lobster on food.
Right.
We're not a pub-based society.
Right. So I think that, you know, it's hard to actually say what is the majority, like what's the most common, because there really is a huge variation. But I think that having some kind of methodology saying like, the data's out there, like what's the government data for an average 2-bedroom apartment or this and that, like that would be a reasonable way to go. And I think that the challenge about the hourly one is it does in fact you could not have a living wage because if you don't have enough hours of work. On the other hand, like Mexico has a minimum wage set by the day, and there's a lot of evidence that workers are just forced to work really long days because employers want to get more work out of them for the day. So I don't know if there's a really ideal scenario. I think the ideal scenario, again, has to come back to worker power. Like whatever the system is in place, workers have enough power to enforce that system and to revise it and change it to make it, represent what their needs are.
The federal tip is only $2.13.
$2.13, right, $2.35, yeah.
In the subsection of economics, people who are called the modern monetary theory folks have a policy platform within it of the guaranteed job at a living wage.
Yeah.
And lots of description of how that works. And the question is, what segment of the activist community around a living wage is recruitable to a campaign for a guaranteed job?
Well, interesting, because I think I hear more talk of a basic income grant, which is not tied to work, than the guaranteed job demand. So I don't know, and I feel like basic income is gaining momentum in other countries. I think Brazil and parts of Europe, but parts of Africa, I think. So I don't know about how many, I think that lots of activists certainly understand the notion of that the wage itself is not enough. We need, the right to work. And we don't need just the right to wage, we need the right to work. But other people are like, well, why should it be tied to work? We certainly have enough money. And even many conservatives have argued that having a basic income grant that covers basic costs of living, regardless of whether or not you work, would be a beneficial thing for society. Covering, rather than spending so much money on all of these programs that are not working that well. I don't know, but I think that's exactly, those are the kinds of conversations I think that this movement should be having. I feel like if you're having the Troy Living Wage Committee, like those would be the kinds of interesting debates and study groups that we should be talking about. Getting going way beyond the boundaries of just saying, should it be 12 or 15? Like that's what I think would be useful.
Yeah. It was in the MMT community, there's this issue of the guaranteed job, guaranteed income. The argument for the guaranteed job is that we actually then mobilize more people to do things that need done.
Yes, that's true, that's true. And I think India has established the 100 days work, like they have now the right to 100 days work. And I think it's debated on the left, like, is that kind of just like degrading? Was what?
Semi-slavery. Right?
Yeah, right. So, but yeah, I think that it's a good discussion, a good debate to have.
Have you studied the law passed, the $15 an hour law passed in Seattle? That's an interesting thing because I remember before it was passed, Sawant said, well, if it's not really $15 an hour, I'm not going to support it.
Yeah.
And then as I understand it, there are a lot of carve-outs in it, and then she, I guess, decided that she should support it and declare it a victory. Can you comment on that law and what's in it?
Actually, I cannot remember all of the specific carve-outs. I do know that the city of Seattle has issued a request for proposals for people to do an economic impact study, getting before and after data and examining each piece of the carve-outs and like looking at, trying to evaluate should that have been included or not. So it's way too early to say exactly what we will find out from that. I'm pretty sure I know the economists that are going to be studying that, but I don't think they're going to have any data until next summer. One of the issues was it was given a very long phase-in, so it's that was a problem. Small businesses, that was a problem. There's always the issue on nonprofits. So I don't remember actually the specific details on what it ended up happening. I know San Francisco had carved out a number of nonprofits, and so there's been a push to get those covered. One of the ways some of the people have proposed, like, well, maybe we could address nonprofits by looking at some kind of ratio of their budget. Some of the living wages cover an 8-to-1 salary ratio. So if the head of the nonprofit makes more than 8-to-1 of the lowest wage worker, then they would be covered by the living wage. If it's less, then they don't.
Wealthy nonprofit. We had a seminar at our annual, my agency's annual, how to make money in the nonprofit. Because pile up massive amounts of money sometimes.
Yeah.
The CEO can say, you know, some, I don't know, it's some, there's nonprofit and there's nonprofit and there's
Right.
nonprofits. So,
Right, right.
yeah.
Well, and like the Boston Living Wage Ordinance has, like everyone's covered, but then it has an enforcement board where if you want you can ask for an exemption, but you have to go and open your books and make the case that we are in fact a struggling nonprofit. We cannot, in fact, because it covers a lot of child care providers. Some of those are in fact, very wealthy companies, and so they could not get the exemption. Some of them were, and some of them were unionized, and some of them said, look, we don't have, you know, not the unionized ones, but some of them said, we're small, you know, mom and pop childcare, we can't cover. So that would be another way to handle it, which is to say everyone's covered, but we have a transparent, open process for applying for an exemption where you have to open your books. Others could have these kind of ratio differences in salaries. So, you know, I think there's, you know, ways to tinker around that, like figure out the best way to cover or not. But unfortunately, I don't know yet, like what we can say about Seattle.
Let's go to the back.
Shouldn't a living wage be based on whether the worker can live on it, not whether the company can afford it?
Well, you would think so. Like that's a good idea. Then I think then you don't have capitalism anymore. So I think you have to be thinking about where, you know, certainly that's where we want to head. But I actually don't think, personally, I don't know that capitalism is sustainable, paying living wages for everyone. I don't know I think you've transformed it into something else. So, but if you start from that principle, then that would be the principle that we would be, if we're fully unionized and workers have the power to say this is what we think we need and what we deserve and we're going to bargain for that. But certainly we have lots of evidence that then the company's like, okay, bye, see ya, I'm shutting down, you know, I'm moving. And I think that we've seen that in in Sweden, workers were demanding, okay, we're going to actually begin to socialize our companies. We're going to take our wages in the form of ownership of the company, and suddenly all the people are, you know, employers are striking in the streets and moving to other countries. So I think it's hard to, I guess I'm saying it's hard to do that under our current system that allows investors to take their money and move it wherever they want, and where people don't have the power to move across borders, but money does. So I just think that that's just our problem. So I agree with you. That's the principle we want. So how to get there is maybe the challenge.
Fred?
In living wage campaigns, have you seen where organizations or unions particularly have developed any structures of, say, associate memberships at low or no dues, so that these workers who are without a union and maybe in a situation where it's difficult to bring one in right away have some structure to relate to and can associate with other like-minded workers?
I don't know about the living wage campaigns, but I mean, I think our Walmart is trying to do that. That's what our Walmart is, and I think Working America. Working America is remember the AFL-CIO organization that's a membership based. So I think those are both in that kind of vein of trying to do that, of trying to like have an organization that low-wage workers can join. I can't think of any that were like very specifically tied to one specific living wage campaign. But I think, you know, it's an idea that makes sense. But ideally, like tying it into a national structure would be useful, so that you feel like some sense of, you know, more power.
What's the Working America? I mean, there's people here that are have been heads of labor councils.
Yeah.
And I've never heard of it in our area, even though we have a pretty
okay.
active labor movement.
Oh, yeah, do you
There's a reason for that. They've carved out certain states they want to work in.
What?
Mostly, they're concentrating on a few states.
Swing states, I
I
bet.
think the Midwest.
Minnesota has a big,
I think ironically, Prairie Wells, if you remember her, is one of the people working on it.
So it's
Well, plus you don't get the AFL-CIO emails, okay? So every once in a while they mention it.
But
Every
do they
once in
have
a
a
while
group
I
where-
send it out.
They have a meeting where people can come to join?
I think they got a magazine and they have local chapters.
Got to get you in the loop, Fred.
Yeah, well, they have a local chapter, I'd love to go to their meeting.
Well, you probably have to travel to Chicago.
That's the local chapter?
Well, I mean a chapter.
yeah, I think that they, they've probably not formed nationally. I know there's organizers like, I think in Florida was a big state, Minnesota, Illinois, and they have organizers that like go door to door and you can sign up and be a member. And I don't really know all the benefits it gives you. I mean, I know that they are doing like some, like I think maybe some helping people get on health insurance and stuff like that, but I don't know all the full benefits.
Because I think that's really important, and I think it's silly that there hasn't been more attention to that. Just a few solidarity notes left there. We're part of the raising the wage that just jumped off here in the area with Citizen Action and the New York State Labor Religion Coalition and the Solidarity Committee. I have an article on what Marty brought about the tipped wage in there. And we are looking for tipped workers to testify at various hearings. You said you're going to testify at the one in New York City?
Yeah.
There's a wage board that the Department of Labor has put together on this issue. So if you know any tipped workers who would like to testify about how they've been sexually harassed on the job to get their tips, how they've been taken for their money because the employer didn't bring the wage up, the wage theft issue, now's the time to find them and to have them step up, and those organizations can help them craft their testimony and get to the hearing in Albany, which will be, I believe, it's in the newsletter, but
December 9th.
December 9th. So if anybody wants to see me about that, or the Solidarity Committee, or Citizen Action, Mark Emanation, I talked to him recently on it, we have a chance to actually get workers and plug them into this right in our area, right here. And we have a couple months, and it's also the anniversary of the International Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt's piece that she did at the UN around the 10th, so we could do something really nice in our area about that. Sorry, bust in on this.
No. That's all the same topic.
So I actually have a question myself. I'll call on myself at this point. On Friday, I'm teaching my Creating Social Justice class and bringing in the same guest speakers I mentioned earlier. And this last Friday, I had Jud Crasher, who's a progressive member of our Common Council in Albany. And one of the things that he mentioned at the time was that as a member of the Common Council, or the City Council, a lot of people call it, that they don't have the power to raise the minimum wage. That was one of the things he said right off. And I didn't realize this. And I didn't get a chance when I had him there to ask why that was. And you sort of answered that as home rule, which I understand the home rule concept. But, and here's my question, you also mentioned that there are ways around that to some degree in terms of tying government money going to private businesses to higher wages.
Right.
And if there's one thing that Albany knows how to do, it's to throw tens of millions of dollars in private companies in corporate welfare on the claim that they're going to create jobs and the claim that they are going to eventually somehow create enough revenue to pay back all that money that we're handing them in corporate welfare, which I don't think anybody in this room thinks actually is occurring. So I was hoping you could just expand on that as a strategy.
Right.
A little bit, because I'm planning on talking to Judd when I get home.
Yeah. Okay. So So what cities have done is either to say if you have a service contract with the city, if you do janitorial service, landscaping service, a bunch of stuff that used to be city public sector jobs that have been contracted out. The city has a right to set a wage for that, to say you have to pay a higher wage. If the city gives money, it has, like it says, we're giving you these dollars as a tax break or subsidized land or whatever it might be to a company to develop, they also have the right then to demand that you pay a higher wage. We also have the right you all have the right as citizens to say, to go to a new development, like let's say in Albany they're building a brand new mall, to go to the developer and say, we demand that you adopt these community benefits if you're going to get city money, otherwise we're going to block your zoning. These developments have to have the city council approves all this stuff for them, that they get the environmental impact and all that. So you could say, we want you to build a child care center, we want you to build a park, green space, affordable housing, if you're going to get this huge tax break. So you could either tie it to a specific development, or you could pass legislation that says any economic development money comes with these strings attached, that you have to pay this higher wage. So it's ways in which cities seem to have power, to have the authority to do so. There's a couple exemptions, like the city, federal law can exempt in terms of requiring union neutrality at card check, but if the cities seem to have a proprietary interest, like you could make the case that the city will be hurt if there's a lot of strikes and so forth. So in that case, the city could require that development authorize or mandate card check union neutrality.
Or the county could have to pay more food stamp money if you don't pay enough wages, which happens.
Right. So those are a couple ways around it. I mean, at this point in New York, I mean, the push is coming a lot from New York City. We'll see if it really happens. I don't have a lot of confidence in this, but if it happens, then cities will have the authority to set a city minimum wage up to 30% above the state. So that may happen in the next couple of months. So otherwise, that tying to economic development is another strategy.
Let's knock on wood that Cuomo actually does any of the things he ever promises.
Yeah, right.
So,
yeah, I just wanted to sort of build on that same question. Like, a lot of what we've seen, like for instance, in the environmental movement, we've seen, attempts to sort of circumvent, I wonder if this is the right word, but basically just to get around the general inaction of our city the state capital here in New York around issues like hydrofracking by passing legislation at a local level, individual municipalities at the county level, hydrofracking ban on public lands, on all lands, yada yada yada. I wonder if there are any examples in the living wage, minimum wage, movement across the country of, even though there's maybe law in place that blocks these sort of home rule, blocks like wages and at a local level like that, if there's been an effort by renegade city councils or town boards to just pass the legislation regardless, and sort of force the issue in that sense, take it to the courts like the hydrofracking movement has.
It's a good, actually I think the only example I could, like in some of the cases it's been questionable, like it's not totally clear what the cities have the right to do, and Wisconsin, a number of cities, Madison, Eau Claire, and Milwaukee all passed citywide minimum, and then that went to the Supreme Court and the state Supreme Court, and they overruled it. So that was an attempt for them saying like it's not clear, let's do it. I'm trying to think of there might have been others that, actually in Virginia there was also, same thing, Arlington and Alexandria, I think they were told that they could not do it and the city councils ended up doing it and then the state just backed off. So that was a case, I think. No wait, I'm sorry, those were not citywide. They were told that they couldn't even set a living wage and they did it anyways. So I think for me, part of the lesson was to watch that first campaign in Baltimore when people were told you just can't do anything at all, and then people pushed and got it attached to the contracts, and and again, like lawyers were telling us for 15 years, you just can't do it in New York. So I think it's also like changing the notion of what's possible. I mean, it does require, if that's going to happen, it requires people really pushing the council and then having people elected to office in the council who might do stuff. So one thing, this is not really your question, but I think throughout the lesson I saw though from people like individual progressives who got into office and thought they would do something good, mostly that failed. I think if there was not a movement pushing it, it wasn't going to work. Even if they got something passed, it would be either revoked or not enforced. So for me, I always said to people like, even if you think you can pass this right away, don't. Like one of the main benefits of this is the political organizing. Build a 2-year campaign, make a 2-year timeline, use it to build your coalition, target each of your council members, have a campaign aimed at them over 2 years. The organizing itself is partly the main victory here, not necessarily the legislation. So pushing the notion of what's possible, pushing people's identities as political agents and actors, that to me is part of the value. So it's not really an answer to your question.
But it's critical, it's beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah.
If organizing is the tool, the solution to most of our problems, is there a source where, I'll tell you, in Troy Area Labor Council, we want to do a handout on like living wage, $15 minimum at this event, public event in Troy in December. What we need is like a one-pager, something short and sweet, couple of bullets, maybe some background information. where would we get something like that without rewriting it ourselves?
Great question. What's interesting is we had so much material, available flyers from campaigns around the country, posted at the National Living Wage Resource Center, which was housed in Acorn, and that is all gone. It's gone. But I think that there's still stuff around, so maybe I can search and try and find something for you. We lost our whole the whole database of all the cities' ordinances and what they had. I don't know why it wasn't backed up. Don't ask me that. But it happened so quickly. There is
a website that has archives of every website.
Yeah.
Did you try that to see if you could find
We
it?
did. We tried like Google Cached and all that. So yeah. And a lot of the stuff still exists in hard copy in boxes, like in my attic and my friend Jen's attic. And we've tried to put it in the archives in different libraries, and they're like, well, you have to get it all organized first, and we haven't had a chance. But why don't I can look for you, like try and look at one page. I should make sure to get your contact for it and give it to John. I'll give it to John, yeah.
All right, I think seems we've exhausted the questions. Am I missing anybody? Hope not. If not,